Lord of the Rings, one of the most famous and beloved fantasy IPs of all time, and practically the one who started it all, let's be honest. A story writer Tolkien wrote almost nearly 100 years ago. In the early 2000s, most famously, these iconic fantasy books were translated by director Peter Jackson into what would become massively successful movies, forming much of what would become pop culture for the next generations too, and managing to keep the old IP new. Following this domination at the box office, Lord of the Rings would have a number of games in the universe made over the course of the next decade or so, but despite the popularity of the IP, Lord of the Rings games were unable to find the same level of popularity as like Star Wars games or even other IPs, despite managing to still put out some cult classics in the process. By the 2020s, the most successful game in the Lord of the Rings IP franchise history was an open-world action game that mostly abandoned the lore of the franchise in favor of fanon instead, but managed to sell well off the strength of its unique Nemesis gameplay system and graphical presentation. Following this, things were kind of quiet for Lord of the Rings games. That was until two Lord of the Rings projects were announced in near tandem, a new never-launched and cancelled MMORPG that was supposed to come from Amazon Game Studios behind New World, and the other, a stealth adventure game that seemed to take inspiration from titles like Prince of Persia and A Plague Tale: Innocence, first teased back in 2018. This single-player narrative-focused game would drop after multiple delays in the summer of 2023. It would go on to not just be rated the worst Lord of the Rings game, but rated one of the worst games of all time. Lord of the Rings Gollum told from the perspective of the hated and loved Gollum and Smeagol duo, a split personality that now lives in the form of what used to be a hobbit but looks more like a goblin now. An interesting premise. But that was sadly just it. Just about everything else would fall quite short of expectations, with the parent development studio working behind the game, Daedalic Entertainment, having been shuttered altogether shortly after the game's launch. What went wrong with Daedalic's attempt at a stealth adventure game, and why did it ultimately find itself on the Death of a Game series? A series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to a game or company's death or process of dying, utilizing a timeline of events filled with clues, developer testimonies, and most important of all, detective intuition. This all culminates in a final deduction, where we, as classic detectives do, crack the case for good. You know, in case you missed any of the clues. Prepare to lurk in the shadows, detectives, as this mystery requires us to avoid detection and checks notes, do chores? Anyway, to the case. The story begins with the introduction of the main developer, and in some ways the culprit for this case, Daedalic Entertainment, who was founded far back in 2007, but largely had existed as a relatively unknown German video game developer and then publisher for a decade, with the majority of their games being point-and-click adventure-style games. Daedalic, prior to the entrance to the story, was actually recently in financial troubles, having laid off staff, and chose to not renew many temp contracts as well. By my investigation, they weren't in the best position, which likely explains what happened next, which was Daedalic Entertainment pitching the Tolkien estate directly, who owned the book rights for Lord of the Rings, for a narrative-focused adventure game in the universe. Now look, I have to be honest, I have no idea how they were able to eventually win this pitch. I mean, I guess the idea for the Tolkien estate was, these guys are decent at storytelling and that's exactly what we want. But a Lord of the Rings game doesn't usually have the luxury of not being at least like a AA product, and Daedalic Entertainment never had made anything close to a AAA, let alone a AA game. They had largely almost exclusively made narrative point-and-click adventures up to that point, like I aforementioned. This just shows how still inexperienced people in charge of powerful IPs are with gaming as a genre and medium, but I can't really argue the Tolkien estate perspective much besides, well, business. But why would Daedalic Entertainment want to make a Lord of the Rings game? Well, for starters, it's one of the most legendary stories told ever, and not very often adapted into gaming compared to other IPs even. It's kind of uncharted waters. And, well, money, notoriety, and the success, right? All of it could come with a good Lord of the Rings game. But why else? Why take this much of a risk or jump in development? Well, Daedalic wanted to level up. They wanted to be taken more seriously as a studio. But also, based on prior signs, I have to say I think that this was a play of desperation, going after a big game or contract with a hope to turn things around for your aging video game studio. And when you make moves like that, there is usually a litany of issues that follow. And that's what this case is all about. Daedalic would announce their new Lord of the Rings game March 26, 2019, titled Lord of the Rings Gollum, featuring, well, naturally, Gollum. a new action-adventure game set to launch in 2021. The description would read, "The Lord of the Rings Gollum will be based on the books by J.R.R. Tolkien and will follow Gollum's path through those books, but it will also explore new events and details from that journey. So expect something that doesn't break the story or narrative of the original work, but may add a few things that aren't discussed directly in The Lord of the Rings." Which the CEO and co-founder of Daedalic, Karsten Fichtelman, will follow up that the new game will tell Gollum's story from a perspective never seen before in any storytelling medium, all the while staying true to the legendary books of J.R.R. Tolkien. For those unfamiliar with the lore in The Hobbit and, well, the following trilogy, Lord of the Rings, here is a crash course. Gollum was previously known as Smeagol by his hobbit name, but after killing his dear friend in a struggle to capture the one true ring that he just discovered, was on the run following this, slowly changing his personality to an obsessed about his precious, aka the ring, in the process, losing his humanity. He would then be captured by Sauron forces and tortured to reveal information concerning where and who he would eventually lose the ring to in a game of riddles, Bilbo Baggins, Frodo's father of course, and the main character of the prequel story, The Hobbit. This new Gollum game was rumored to be somewhere in between when Gollum is set free from Mordor and when he would be captured by the series hero Aragorn, which was a period of about 8 years. There were, theoretically, a lot of holes that could be filled for storytelling, like when he meets Shelob the giant spider, when he escapes Mirkwood, and more. But I have to say, even early in this case, when I heard the news of this announcement, I was quite skeptical. Gollum was a conflicted character, but he wasn't exactly like a likable character, and it would be a hard sell to make his goals and the player's goals one and the same intuitively, due to his obsession with the ring, something that most of us can't obviously comprehend. It was also strange in the sense that there were so many different characters that they could have chosen besides him, who have more interesting backstories that weren't mostly just like fill-in-the-blank style stories, like Gollum's. And what I mean is that this guy goes evil, loses his precious, goes crazy, gets caught and tortured, flees only to be captured again, before meeting up with Frodo and Sam on their journey to destroy his beloved ring, which is almost like a form of torture in itself. His motivations never change. Neither does his character, really. No matter what part of the timeline we are aware of post the Shire that you see him at, really. But maybe they're trying to argue this is before he's made that full transition. But he's an epic villain, or a character, one who has a fatal flaw, which is ultimately his demise, and he's not one who possessed much power or even wit himself either. I think it was just an odd choice for a character for a full narrative-based adventure game in the Lord of the Rings universe. I mean, maybe as a couple of levels, or maybe even as a character you can play as, but a full game? The upcoming new Gollum game would be delayed the same year it was set to launch, January 2021, with launch moved to the following year. Daedalic Entertainment was on the ropes in early development according to sources. They were already forcing and encouraging work crunch, the process of working past normal hours, usually in an effort to make up for lost time and productivity, and were heavily reliant on a team of contract workers. This is worrying because, well, they, with the contract workers, were only amounting to about like 85 employees working on Gollum, well under the industry standard for like a AAA game. This is likely why they were already suffering from serious delay and production issues from the jump, but it was a problem they were quite aware of going into things. While this might come as a slight surprise to some of us watching, because while Daedalic was suffering from resource and production issues, they would be acquired by the same publisher they were choosing to work with from that point on, for their upcoming Lord of the Rings adventure game in the spring of 2022 for a whopping $60 million. Due to the hastiness in which this occurred after the delay is announced, my detective intuition tells me this was another lifeline thrown to the struggling Daedalic Entertainment, one that was meant to get them past the finish line where they could theoretically reap the rewards. But what came next was one of the most controversial game launches in history, especially for the Lord of the Rings IP. Lord of the Rings Gollum would launch on all major platforms globally May 25th, 2023, and the reception was immediate and incredibly negative. Gollum would score a 33 out of 100 from aggregate review website Metacritic from 56 different critics, and much lower with the users there at 1.6 out of 10, though it managed to score a bit better on Steam at 41 out of 100%. GameSpot in their critical review of the game would score it abysmally low at 2 out of 10, claiming the only positives in the game were the soundtrack and new characters that fleshed out the previously existing lore, while calling the game endlessly buggy and broken and containing primarily repetitive and vanilla level design. Worse, the graphics and gameplay felt a few gens prior to. Game Informer wouldn't score the title much better at 3.5 out of 10, where they would echo many of the same sentiments concerning the technical issues that the game had, but also point out that the sound mixing was so bad that sometimes that it made characters hard to hear, and the lack of detail in the game's textures, and how the most difficult part of the game was the game and its control scheme itself. While you would think controlling Gollum would at least feel fluid, as he's a bit of a rogue himself, he instead feels like piloting a 757 on land. So many of the game's animations lock you in place, making the game feel even clumsier. In the actual things you do in the game, the gameplay loop consists of mostly doing the same repetitive actions, almost like you were doing chores as a slave to Mordor. Oh wait, that's exactly what you were doing, and what was happening in the game. Exciting. But don't get me started on the actual story and lore of the game, which although some critics were positive about, I'm gonna split the difference here and let you know, it's not good. Not only is the story just as I described, you work as a slave for most of the game, and you're stuck in Barad-dûr for virtually all of the game, which involves the same looking poor textured terrain and locations that are limited with what you can do. Even if it was a good game, and it wasn't, it was a game that you would spend more time dying from vertical gameplay scenes and challenges, and hearing the same voice quips than enjoying some gripping tale about the conflict within Gollum and Smeagol. The crown feature of the game was set to be the game's self-argumentation system, where to make a decision, you would have to make an argument against the opposing personality, Smeagol versus Gollum. The system, however, is so incredibly non-consequential and simplistic, it's not worth writing home about at all, or even just writing about, period. To be fair, can you fully blame that lore-wise? Not necessarily. Gollum wasn't redeemed, and the only person who thought he was redeemable was Frodo. And Frodo was wrong about him, so there's not that much nuance there to really begin with. And this is a bit controversial, but I've always thought that Gollum's contribution to the overall journey of Frodo is kind of overrated. But anyway, Gollum taking care of a bird? If you have to invent things that don't fit a character to make them more likable, I think that was a giant warning sign telling you not to make a narrative-focused game based on that character who's not likable. Capiche? But the issues with the Lord of the Rings Gollum were immense, nearly immeasurable, with entire montages dedicated to glitches, bugs, and so much more tomfoolery. Despite how funny the game looked because of how bad it was, I and many others were still sad because anytime a popular IP has an attempt in a new genre and it fails, it doesn't spell well for future games in that genre. And frankly speaking, I would love to see more narrative-focused Lord of the Rings games, but this just wasn't it. And don't listen to my words about it, just look at the game's reception, which according to sources grossed under $400,000 and had around 100,000 copies sold, which would be like 2.5% of the game's original budget according to later reports. This success wasn't at all salvageable for Daedalic Entertainment, and within the next month, they would shut down their video game development studio, the one who had just churned out Gollum June 30th, 2023, making it one of the fastest game failures to company shutdowns on the Death of a Game series yet. This shutdown would affect as many as 25 of the company's 90-plus employees, as much as 27% of the company's workforce. But more details would be revealed the same month concerning Daedalic and their recent failure with Lord of the Rings Gollum. According to sources, Daedalic would explain in a post-mortem statement that they did not receive the necessary support to provide the game with a larger budget or more manpower, which made it sound like they were kind of passing off the blame and saying it was more of a funding issue from their publisher or parent company, Nakon, or perhaps the Tolkien estate, and then would also claim that the game merely had a budget of $16 million, and that the amount of developers they had on the project, which was like 85 reportedly, and budget, combined, couldn't feasibly deliver the right kind of ambitious AAA project that they and many others had envisioned. But the thing is, detectives, they always knew that. My guess is that they had hoped through their dealings with Tolkien and Nakon, they're French, I'm not sure how you pronounce that, who purchased them for $60 million, by the way, would achieve enough support and funding to make the game they wanted to make. But when that support didn't supposedly come, that's why they delivered what they delivered, is what they're saying. But you can't make games or projects based on what-ifs, and maybe we can do this the right way. No, with my experience in project management and construction, the better way to approach it is sell the solution you can do, aka make the game that you actually can make to the best degree. And if you didn't have the money or resources to make a Lord of the Rings game, well, you probably shouldn't have tried. But past resources and budgets and AAA and all of that stuff, Gollum wasn't even close to a good game. It's hard to make a good game when you heavily rely on temporary contract workers, you underpay, and bully with fear of losing their job, which was confirmed in reports concerning Daedalic Entertainment. So I see this less as like the good guys reaching for the stars and having their like Icarus moment, and more like Will Wright with like Spore or something, where you can see no evil and thus do no evil. Quietly in the winter of 2023, the Switch version of Lord of the Rings Gollum would be cancelled, and this would not only conclude the last update or big press release we would see concerning the game, it marks the end of the timeline of this case, detectives, which means we've gathered more than enough clues to crack this case for good. Anyway, in case you missed any of the clues along the way, why did Lord of the Rings Gollum fail so spectacularly it led to the demise of their parent development studio? Lack of polish and production. Out of the scope of depth for the developer, buggy and poor performing, poor work conditions and limited talent, a financial catastrophe, a boring gameplay loop and questionable story choice. Lord of the Rings, for how legendary and quality the story is, just hasn't been able to net that many successful video games yet. And Gollum, sadly, wasn't able to help matters there at all. It wasn't the only attempt, however, with the survival Lord of the Rings game Return to Moria doing half decent, and then a Stardew Valley and Animal Crossing-like game titled Tales of the Shire just last year doing some level of success. Despite the moderate success these games have achieved though, the series is still no closer to entering the main cultural gaming zeitgeist or beyond. But with the Lord of the Rings IP split up into different sections and each of them are seemingly eager to make a hit, like Shadow of Mordor managed to make as a duo series, I think there is still yet a chance we can see a quality game in the Lord of the Rings world. But until that time, detectives, and until the next case, a long-awaited case from the once beloved video game giant.